Sometimes the signature that saves your future is the one that breaks your heart first. Grace Bennett never imagined those words would become the truest sentence of her life. She only knew she had exactly $43 left in her checking account, 3 overdue medical bills sitting unopened on her tiny kitchen table, and a voicemail from her landlord reminding her that rent was already 10 days late. The November rain drummed softly against the apartment window as she buttoned her inexpensive beige coat, took one last glance around the little place she had called home for 4 years, and whispered to herself that somehow everything would be okay. She had repeated those same words every morning since her mother's illness had forced her to work 2 jobs instead of finishing graduate school. Most days she almost believed them. Today she didn't. An hour later, Grace stood behind the espresso machine inside a crowded cafe in downtown Chicago, smiling politely while hiding the exhaustion behind her blue eyes. The morning rush never slowed. Lawyers, bankers, and executives hurried through the line with expensive watches and impatient voices. She greeted every customer with the same warmth because kindness cost nothing, even when everything else seemed impossibly expensive. Just after 9 o'clock, the cafe door opened, and the room changed without anyone realizing why. The man who walked inside wasn't loud. He didn't demand attention. Yet people instinctively stepped aside, as if confidence carried its own gravity. Ethan Carter wore a charcoal overcoat tailored to perfection, his dark hair neatly combed despite the rain outside, his expression calm but distant. At 34, he had built Carter Global into one of the fastest-growing investment companies in America, though very few people recognized him without seeing his photograph beside headlines about billion-dollar mergers. Grace certainly didn't. To her, he looked like another businessman searching for caffeine before another endless meeting. She offered the same friendly smile she gave everyone else. "Good morning. What can I get started for you?" Ethan looked at the menu for barely a second. "Black coffee. No sugar." His voice was low, controlled, almost mechanical. Grace prepared the order quickly before sliding the cup across the counter. As he reached for his wallet, his phone vibrated sharply. He glanced at the screen. The message lasted only a moment before his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His assistant had sent 3 words. "Family meeting. Mandatory attendance." Ethan slipped the phone back into his pocket without another expression. Grace noticed anyway. Years of serving strangers had taught her that people often smiled with their mouths, while their eyes carried entirely different stories. "Rough morning?" she asked gently. Ethan almost ignored the question. "Almost. Something like that." "Well," she replied with a small laugh, "I hope the coffee helps more than it usually helps me." For the first time that morning, the corner of Ethan's mouth lifted ever so slightly. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close enough to surprise both of them. Before he could answer, another customer accidentally bumped into Grace, knocking a folder from Ethan's hand. Several papers scattered across the polished floor. Grace immediately knelt to help gather them. Most pages were filled with legal language she barely understood, but one sheet landed face up directly in front of her. At the top, printed in bold letters, were the words "Confidential Marriage Agreement." Grace blinked. Surely she had read it wrong. She quickly handed the paper back without another glance. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to." Ethan took the documents faster than necessary, carefully sliding that particular page beneath the others. "It's fine." But his expression had changed completely. The warmth that had briefly appeared vanished behind the familiar walls he carried everywhere. He placed a crisp $20 bill on the counter, even though the coffee cost less than $5. "Keep the change." Grace frowned. "Sir, that's too much." "No." Ethan answered quietly while picking up the folder. "It's exactly enough." Then he walked toward the door and disappeared into the gray Chicago morning, leaving Grace staring after a stranger she would probably never see again. She had no idea that hidden inside the folder he carried was the final version of a contract that would decide the future of a billion-dollar empire. She had no idea that within 48 hours the same man would walk back into her life with an offer so unbelievable it would sound less like reality and more like the beginning of an impossible fairy tale. Most of all, she had no idea that when she finally signed her name, she would forget to read the very last page. Grace barely slept that night. The image of the confidential document kept replaying in her mind, not because she was curious about a stranger's private business, but because there had been something unusual in his eyes. He had looked like a man carrying a burden no amount of money could make lighter. By sunrise, she had almost convinced herself she would never see him again. Life had a way of introducing people only to let them disappear before they became important. Her reality quickly demanded her attention instead. She spent the morning accompanying her mother to another medical appointment across town. The waiting room smelled faintly of coffee and antiseptic, and every passing minute reminded Grace how expensive hope could become. Her mother's doctor remained encouraging, explaining that the treatment was working, but the next phase would require additional medication that insurance would only partially cover. Grace nodded politely while mentally adding another impossible number to the growing list inside her head. As they left the clinic, her mother reached for her hand. "You look tired, sweetheart." Grace forced a smile. "I am just working too much." "You are carrying too much because of me." Grace immediately shook her head. "Never say that. You spent your whole life taking care of me. Let me take care of you now." Her mother smiled softly, but Grace noticed the sadness hiding behind it. Parents always knew more than they admitted. After dropping her mother home, Grace checked her voicemail before starting her afternoon shift. The first message came from the utility company reminding her that the final payment deadline was only 4 days away. The second was from her landlord. This time his voice sounded less patient than before. If the balance was not paid by Friday, eviction paperwork would begin on Monday morning. Grace closed her eyes for a long second before slipping the phone back into her pocket. She refused to cry where strangers could see her. By late afternoon, the cafe slowed into its quieter rhythm. Rain tapped gently against the windows while soft jazz floated through the speakers overhead. Grace wiped down empty tables, grateful for a rare moment of silence. Then the front door opened again. She looked up instinctively and nearly dropped the towel in her hand. Ethan Carter walked inside wearing the same calm expression, though today there was something different. It was as if he had already made a difficult decision before stepping through the door. He approached the counter without ordering. "Good afternoon, Grace." She blinked. "You remembered my name. I make it a habit to remember people who are kind to me." She smiled politely. "Another black coffee?" "Not today." He glanced toward the nearly empty seating area. "Would you be willing to sit with me for 10 minutes after your shift?" Grace hesitated. Every instinct told her to be cautious. She knew almost nothing about him except his first name and the mysterious papers she had accidentally seen. "Is something wrong?" she asked carefully. "No," Ethan replied. "Actually, I hope this conversation might solve a problem for both of us." Before Grace could ask another question, the cafe manager walked over carrying an uneasy expression. "Grace, could I speak with you in the office for a minute?" She excused herself and followed him into the small back room. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, but it felt much longer. Business had slowed over the past 2 months. Corporate headquarters had ordered immediate staffing reductions. Her manager apologized repeatedly, explaining that none of it reflected her work ethic. Unfortunately, beginning next week, her full-time schedule would become part-time. Nearly half her income would disappear overnight. Grace thanked him for his honesty, gathered her apron, and walked back onto the floor feeling strangely numb. Ethan noticed the change in her expression immediately. "Bad news." She laughed quietly, though there was no happiness in the sound. "Apparently life decided I needed another challenge." Ethan studied her for a moment without speaking. Then he reached into the leather folder resting beside him and removed a sealed ivory envelope. He gently slid it across the table. "Inside is an opportunity. I am asking you not to answer immediately. Read everything carefully before you decide." Grace looked at the envelope but did not touch it. "Why me?" Ethan's answer came without hesitation. "Because yesterday you offered honesty when everyone else offered performance. And right now I need someone the world cannot buy." Grace slowly picked up the envelope, feeling the unexpected weight of the thick papers inside. She still had no idea that the decision waiting between those pages would change not only her financial future, but the meaning of trust, love, and every promise she believed could only exist on paper. Grace waited until she returned to her apartment before opening the envelope. The building hallway was unusually quiet, and the worn wooden steps creaked beneath her feet, as if reminding her that every month she barely managed to stay there. She placed the envelope on the tiny kitchen table beside the unpaid bills and stared at it for nearly a full minute. Whatever was inside had been prepared carefully. The cream-colored paper felt expensive, the kind used by people who never had to compare grocery prices before filling a shopping cart. Finally, she broke the seal and unfolded the first page. At the very top, centered in elegant lettering, were the words "Confidential Personal Agreement." Her heartbeat quickened. She continued reading slowly, making sure she understood every sentence. Ethan Carter requested that Grace Bennett serve as his fiancée for 30 days. In return, he would provide a financial payment large enough to eliminate every debt she currently carried, cover her mother's medical treatment for the next year, and provide temporary housing during the agreement. Grace stopped reading. She looked around her small apartment, almost laughing at the impossible contrast between her surroundings and the offer sitting in her hands. Surely this had to be some kind of mistake. Yet every page looked professionally prepared. Every paragraph had been reviewed by attorneys. Every detail appeared real. There were no hidden promises about romance. No unrealistic expectations. Only conditions. She continued reading. Rule number 1. The engagement would exist only in public appearances and official family events. Rule number 2. Both parties would maintain mutual respect and honesty throughout the agreement. Rule number 3. Personal boundaries would always be respected. Rule number 4. Neither party would make personal decisions on behalf of the other without consent. Rule number 5. Complete confidentiality until the agreement officially ended. Grace quietly placed the papers back on the table. She had expected something manipulative or inappropriate. Instead, the document felt strangely formal, almost cold. It sounded less like the beginning of a relationship and more like the hiring process for an executive position. Her phone rang before she could gather another thought. The caller identification displayed Ethan's name. She hesitated before answering. "Did you finish reading?" he asked. "Most of it. Would you meet me tomorrow morning?" There are questions the paperwork cannot answer. Grace looked toward the window where city lights reflected across the rain-soaked streets. All right. The following morning, she arrived at the address Ethan had texted her. It was not a corporate office or a luxury hotel. Instead, it was a quiet private garden overlooking Lake Michigan, nearly empty except for a few people walking their dogs. Ethan stood beside a stone fountain, wearing a navy coat and dark gloves, looking more relaxed than she had seen before. He greeted her with a polite smile. "Thank you for coming." Grace folded her arms against the chilly wind. "I have about 100 questions." I expected at least that many. They began walking slowly along the lakeside path. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, Grace broke the silence. "Why does a billionaire need a fake fiancée?" Ethan looked out across the water before answering. "My grandfather built our company from nothing. Before he passed away, he created conditions for the family trust. According to those conditions, the next chief executive officer must demonstrate long-term personal stability before assuming complete control of the company. My board interprets that to include an engagement before next month's annual meeting." Grace frowned. "So this is about business?" "Partly." He nodded. "But it is also about ending constant speculation from investors, the media, and members of my own family. Why not date someone for real?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Because everyone I meet already knows exactly how much I am worth before they know my favorite book or the name of my childhood dog." Grace could not help smiling. "What was your dog's name?" "Oliver." "See," she replied softly. "That answer sounded more genuine than everything else you have said." Ethan laughed quietly, surprising himself. The sound disappeared almost as quickly as it came, but Grace noticed it. For the first time, she saw not the billionaire whose face occasionally appeared on business magazines, but a lonely man trapped inside responsibilities he had never truly chosen. Ethan reached into his coat pocket and handed her a small velvet box. Grace looked at him in confusion before opening it. Inside rested a simple diamond engagement ring that shimmered beneath the gray morning sky. It was elegant without being excessive, beautiful without demanding attention. "If you accept," Ethan said calmly, "this will become part of the story the world sees. You are free to decline. There will be no pressure." Grace stared at the ring, then at the agreement still resting inside her handbag. She had carefully read every page except the final one, believing it contained only signatures and legal language. Without realizing it, she had overlooked the only paragraph that would eventually matter more than every promise made before it. Grace did not answer immediately. She closed the velvet box carefully and held it in both hands as the cold breeze drifted across Lake Michigan. The tiny diamond caught a brief ray of sunlight before disappearing beneath the gray clouds again. It felt strangely symbolic, beautiful, valuable, and completely dependent on the story surrounding it. Ethan waited patiently without trying to persuade her. That silence told Grace more about his character than any polished speech could have. Most powerful men she had encountered expected quick answers because they were accustomed to getting what they wanted. Ethan simply waited. After several long moments, Grace finally looked into his eyes. "If I say yes, I need one promise that is not written in your contract." Ethan nodded. "Name it. Do not ever treat me like I am part of the payment." His expression softened almost immediately. "I would never insult you that way. I mean it." Her voice remained steady. "I can accept a temporary role. I can even pretend to love someone for business dinners if that is what this requires. But I cannot pretend to respect someone who forgets I am a real person." Ethan answered without hesitation. "Then let us make that our first unwritten rule. We protect each other's dignity no matter what happens." Grace slowly extended her hand. Instead of placing the ring on her finger, Ethan simply shook her hand with quiet sincerity. It felt less like signing a business arrangement and more like forming an unusual partnership. 2 days later, Grace found herself standing inside Carter Manor, the historic family estate located just outside Chicago. The stone mansion overlooked acres of perfectly maintained gardens, with towering oak trees framing the long driveway. Every room seemed larger than her entire apartment. Sunlight poured through enormous windows onto polished hardwood floors that reflected generations of family portraits. Grace tried not to stare, but everything around her belonged to a world she had only seen in magazines. A woman in her early 60s approached with a warm smile. "You must be Grace." "I am Margaret, Mr. Carter's executive house manager." Grace smiled with relief. Margaret's kindness immediately eased some of the tension. "It is nice to meet you. We have heard wonderful things already." Grace glanced toward Ethan. "That is surprising since he barely knows me." Margaret smiled knowingly. Sometimes character introduces itself faster than history. Throughout the afternoon, Grace met Ethan's small support team. His assistant Daniel carefully reviewed the upcoming schedule. A professional image consultant named Rebecca explained wardrobe selections for charity events and formal dinners. A communications advisor walked Grace through likely questions from reporters. At first, the entire process felt overwhelming. She worried about using the wrong fork at dinner, greeting influential people incorrectly, or embarrassing Ethan in front of his business partners. Rebecca noticed the concern almost immediately. "You know what the easiest mistake is?" she asked while adjusting a navy dress on the fitting mannequin. Grace shook her head. "People think elegance comes from expensive clothing. It does not. Confidence comes from making other people feel comfortable. Everything else is decoration." Those words stayed with Grace longer than the fashion lesson itself. Later that evening, Ethan found her standing alone on the library balcony overlooking the gardens. The mansion had grown quiet after the staff finished preparing for the next day's charity reception. He carried 2 mugs of hot chocolate instead of coffee. Margaret insisted. He explained while handing one to Grace. She believes difficult conversations should never happen on an empty stomach. Grace smiled. "I think I already like her." They stood together watching the fountain below. "Are you afraid?" Ethan asked after a while. Grace considered the question honestly. "Yes, I am afraid I will disappoint everyone in your world." Ethan looked toward the lights stretching across the distant city skyline. "I am afraid every day too." Grace turned toward him with genuine surprise. "You? What could possibly frighten someone who runs an international company?" He released a quiet breath. "Losing the company would disappoint thousands of employees. Losing my family's trust would disappoint generations before me. But losing myself while trying to satisfy everyone else." He paused before finishing. "That is the fear I never admit out loud." Grace realized then that behind every expensive suit and confident decision lived a man carrying responsibilities heavier than anyone could see. Wealth had protected him from many hardships, but it had not protected him from loneliness. The next morning, cameras flashed outside the mansion gates as reporters gathered for the official engagement announcement. Grace took one slow breath before stepping beside Ethan. She felt the small velvet ring box resting safely inside her handbag, waiting for its public debut. Neither of them noticed the folded final page of the agreement tucked beneath the signed copies in Ethan's attorney's briefcase, quietly carrying a single overlooked clause that would eventually test every promise they believed they had just made. The engagement announcement spread across Chicago before lunchtime. Business websites published polished photographs of Ethan Carter standing beside the mysterious woman no one had seen before. Lifestyle magazines praised Grace's quiet elegance, while financial reporters focused on how the engagement appeared to satisfy long-standing questions surrounding Carter Global's future leadership. Grace tried not to read any of the articles, but avoiding them became impossible. Every television inside the mansion seemed to mention their names. Every notification on Daniel's tablet announced another interview request. By late afternoon, the first major charity gala arrived, and with it came the real test neither of them could rehearse completely. The grand ballroom shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers, their warm light reflecting across polished marble floors and tables decorated with white roses. Chicago's most influential business leaders, philanthropists, and civic officials filled the room with polished conversations and carefully measured smiles. Grace paused near the entrance, smoothing the sleeve of her midnight blue gown. She had practiced introductions for 2 days, memorized dozens of names, and learned enough etiquette to survive almost any formal dinner. Even so, her heart refused to slow down. Ethan noticed immediately. Without drawing attention, he quietly offered his arm. "You are doing fine already," he said. Grace gave a nervous smile. "We have not even walked inside." "Exactly. The hardest part is believing you belong before anyone else does." His words settled her more than he probably realized. Together, they entered the ballroom. Cameras flashed briefly before guests returned to their conversations. One by one, Ethan introduced Grace to board members, nonprofit directors, and longtime family friends. She listened carefully instead of trying to impress anyone. When people spoke about their charities, she asked thoughtful questions. When volunteers described community projects, she remembered their names. Her sincerity felt effortless because it was genuine. Across the room, several board members quietly observed the interactions. One elderly investor leaned toward another and whispered, "She does not sound rehearsed." The other nodded. "No, she actually listens." Ethan heard neither comment, but he noticed something else. Grace made people smile without trying. That rare quality could not be purchased or coached. Halfway through the evening, the program director stepped onto the stage to introduce a scholarship initiative supporting first-generation college students. A large digital presentation was scheduled to appear behind her. Instead, the screen suddenly displayed incomplete financial charts prepared for a confidential board meeting. Several guests exchanged confused looks. Reporters immediately lifted their cameras. The event coordinator froze, uncertain how to respond. Grace recognized panic spreading through the room. Before anyone else reacted, she quietly approached the master of ceremonies and whispered something into his ear. He looked surprised, then nodded. Seconds later, he smiled warmly at the audience. "While our technical team corrects an unexpected file mix-up, perhaps we can hear from someone whose personal experience reminds us exactly why this scholarship exists." Before Grace fully realized what was happening, the microphone was gently placed into her hands. Hundreds of faces turned toward her. She swallowed once, then spoke honestly. "I never planned to stand on this stage tonight, but I do know what it feels like to wonder whether education, opportunity, or even tomorrow's rent might disappear because life became more expensive than your dreams. Sometimes the greatest investment is simply believing someone deserves a chance before they have the chance to prove themselves." The ballroom grew remarkably quiet. Grace continued with calm sincerity. "Every student receiving one of these scholarships will remember that someone believed in them long before they believed in themselves. That kind of generosity changes families for generations." Soft applause began near the front of the room before spreading throughout the ballroom. At that exact moment, the presentation returned to normal, displaying photographs of scholarship recipients instead of confidential charts. The crisis had ended almost without anyone noticing. As guests resumed their conversations, several donors quietly increased their pledged contributions. Ethan remained standing beside the stage, watching Grace with genuine admiration. She had not rescued the evening with polished public relations. She had rescued it by speaking from her own life. Later, as the orchestra began a gentle instrumental piece, one photographer called across the ballroom, "Mr. Carter, over here." One photograph with your fiancé, please. Ethan instinctively stepped beside Grace. She looked up at him, still holding the emotion of her speech. For a brief moment, neither remembered the cameras surrounding them. They simply smiled at each other naturally, the distance between them disappearing without effort. The photograph captured that unguarded expression perfectly, and although neither of them realized it yet, something far more dangerous than a business arrangement had quietly begun. The first unwritten rule remained intact, but somewhere beneath the elegance, the carefully negotiated boundaries had started to blur. The photograph from the gala appeared everywhere the following morning. Business journals praised Ethan's composed leadership, but nearly every headline focused on Grace's heartfelt speech instead. Comment sections filled with unexpected admiration for the woman no one had known a week earlier. Employees inside Carter Global shared the video across the company's internal network, calling her authentic, refreshing, and exactly the kind of person they hoped would one day represent the Carter family. Grace found the attention overwhelming. She had spent years trying not to be noticed, and suddenly complete strangers believed they knew her. Ethan, however, noticed something more important. For the first time in years, the public conversation surrounding his company centered on compassion instead of quarterly profits. Even his grandfather's oldest friends began sending handwritten notes praising the engagement. It should have felt like a victory. Instead, a quiet sense of guilt settled over Ethan every time he looked at Grace. She deserved honest happiness, yet every smile she offered the world rested on a carefully constructed lie. 3 days later, the Carter family gathered for a private dinner at the estate. Long polished tables, silver candle holders, and familiar family portraits created an atmosphere that was elegant yet strangely tense. Grace sensed it before anyone spoke. She greeted each relative politely, remembering every name Margaret had helped her memorize, but one woman watched her with unmistakable skepticism. Victoria Langford, Ethan's former girlfriend and now a senior executive within Carter Global, arrived fashionably late, with effortless confidence. She greeted the family warmly before her eyes settled on Grace. The smile that followed was perfectly polite and completely insincere. "So you are the woman everyone is talking about," Victoria said smoothly. Grace extended her hand. "It is nice to meet you." Victoria accepted the handshake for only a brief second. "I have followed Ethan's life for years, yet somehow I never heard your name until last week." "What an extraordinary coincidence," Grace answered calmly. "Life has a way of surprising people." Ethan stepped beside Grace before the conversation could continue. "Dinner is ready." Throughout the meal, Victoria asked seemingly harmless questions that felt carefully designed to expose every weakness. Which boarding school had Grace attended? Which family vacations did she remember most? Which European cities did she enjoy visiting? Grace answered each question honestly. She had attended public schools. Family vacations meant weekend picnics at a nearby state park whenever her mother could afford gasoline. She had never traveled outside the United States. Several relatives exchanged quiet glances, but instead of appearing embarrassed, Grace simply smiled. "Those experiences taught me to appreciate every opportunity one received now." An unexpected silence followed. Even Victoria seemed uncertain how to challenge sincerity without appearing cruel. Ethan watched Grace with growing admiration. She never pretended to be someone else. She simply refused to apologize for where she came from. After dinner, the family gathered in the library for coffee. Ethan's uncle Richard, a longtime board member, placed a folder on the coffee table. "The annual board meeting is only 3 weeks away," he announced. "The trustees are pleased with recent developments, but they expect stability. Public confidence is improving. We cannot afford another surprise." Ethan nodded. "You have my word." Grace quietly excused herself, believing the conversation belonged to the family. As she walked toward the hallway, she accidentally overheard Victoria speaking in a lowered voice. "Do you really believe this engagement happened naturally?" She appeared out of nowhere. Nobody builds trust that quickly unless someone is hiding something. Grace continued walking without reacting, but the words stayed with her. Later that evening, she stood alone in the mansion's sunroom overlooking the dark gardens. Ethan found her there holding a cup of tea that had already gone cold. "You heard part of the conversation." It was not a question. Grace nodded gently. "People are going to keep wondering whether I belong here." Ethan stepped closer, keeping a respectful distance. "Do you?" Grace looked out toward the fountain where soft lights reflected across the water. I belong beside my mother. I belong in the neighborhood where everyone knows my name. This world still feels borrowed. Ethan answered quietly. When I was 12, my grandfather told me something I never forgot. He said the people who truly belong in a room are usually the ones asking how they can help instead of how important they appear. Grace smiled faintly. Your grandfather sounds wiser than most billionaires. Ethan laughed softly. He would have liked you. Neither of them noticed Daniel approaching with an overnight package that had just arrived from the company's legal office. Inside were finalized copies of every agreement related to the engagement, including the overlooked last page that no one had discussed. As Daniel placed the unopened envelope inside Ethan's study for the next day's review, a single sentence remained hidden beneath the sealed flap, waiting for the moment it would transform an ordinary contract into the greatest test either of them had ever faced. The next morning began with unexpected peace. Sunlight poured through the tall windows of Carter Manor, painting warm streaks across the hardwood floors as Grace carried 2 mugs of coffee toward Ethan's study. It had quietly become part of their routine. He preferred black coffee before reading reports, and she had discovered that preparing it gave her a few extra moments to organize her thoughts before another day of pretending to be someone she never expected to become. She knocked gently before entering. Ethan looked up from a stack of legal documents and smiled, no longer surprised to see her. You remembered. Grace placed the mug beside him. You have a board conference in 20 minutes. I figured caffeine would improve everyone's chances. Ethan laughed softly. Especially mine. For a brief moment the room felt completely ordinary. No cameras. No contracts. No billion-dollar expectations. Just 2 people sharing a quiet morning. Then Daniel appeared at the doorway carrying the overnight legal package. These are the finalized copies from Harrison and Cole, he explained. The attorneys asked that you review every page before next week's trustee meeting. Ethan thanked him and placed the envelope beside the other paperwork without opening it. Neither he nor Grace realized that the forgotten final page still rested inside. The comm ended shortly after noon. Victoria requested an emergency executive meeting with several board members, claiming she had discovered information affecting the credibility of Carter Global's leadership. By early afternoon, whispers spread through headquarters. Employees exchanged uncertain glances. Reporters began gathering outside the building once again. Daniel quietly informed Ethan that someone had anonymously questioned the authenticity of the engagement. Ethan remained outwardly composed, but Grace noticed the subtle tightening of his jaw. Do you think it is Victoria? She asked as they prepared to leave for headquarters. Ethan adjusted his tie before answering. I cannot accuse anyone without proof. Grace nodded. But you already know. He looked at her with quiet honesty. I know some people believe trust is easier to destroy than earn. The executive conference room overlooked downtown Chicago through floor-to-ceiling windows. Around the polished table sat directors, legal advisors, and senior executives. Victoria remained perfectly calm as the meeting began. I appreciate everyone's time, she said confidently. This company depends upon integrity. If investors believe they have been misled, every decision we make will be questioned. Richard folded his hands. Get to the point. Victoria pressed a button on the presentation screen. Several photographs appeared showing Grace working behind the cafe counter only days before the engagement announcement. Another image showed her small apartment building. This woman entered our lives less than 2 weeks ago, Victoria continued. No one in this room knew she existed. Yet we are expected to believe this relationship developed naturally, while Mr. Carter happened to satisfy every requirement for the family trust. The room grew silent. Grace felt dozens of eyes settle upon her. Victoria continued with measured confidence. Perhaps there is a simple explanation. Or perhaps this engagement is merely a carefully planned arrangement. Ethan stood immediately. Enough. His voice remained calm, but every word carried unmistakable authority. Grace's personal history is not on trial. Victoria crossed her arms. Then answer one question. Did your relationship begin before or after discussions regarding the trust? Ethan hesitated for only a fraction of a second. That tiny pause was enough to change the atmosphere. Grace understood exactly why. He refused to lie, yet telling the complete truth would expose everything. Before Ethan could answer, Grace quietly stood beside him. "I will answer." Ethan looked at her with concern. She gave him a reassuring glance before facing the room. "I grew up in a neighborhood where people judged character by how someone treated their neighbors, not by the size of their home. I never imagined standing inside this building, and I certainly never imagined becoming part of this family. You have every right to question whether I belong here. But if you believe kindness, honesty, and respect make someone unqualified because they were learned in a small apartment instead of a mansion, then perhaps you are asking the wrong question." Several directors lowered their eyes. Even Richard seemed thoughtful. Victoria, however, was not finished. She slowly reached into her briefcase and removed another sealed envelope. "Interesting speech," she said quietly. "I wonder whether everyone will feel the same after reading the complete engagement agreement." Grace felt her heart sink. Ethan immediately recognized the envelope. It contained the finalized contract from the attorneys. Before anyone could stop her, Victoria opened it and began turning the pages until she reached the very last one. Her confident smile widened. "Here it is," she announced. "The page everyone seems to have overlooked." Ethan's expression changed instantly as he realized neither he nor Grace had ever read the final clause after signing the agreement. And for the first time since this extraordinary arrangement had begun, he understood that the greatest threat to their future had never been hidden outside the contract at all. It had been waiting quietly inside it from the very beginning. The conference room fell completely silent as Victoria lifted the final page high enough for every director to see. Her confidence filled the room before her voice did. "Section 14, she read slowly. "Upon completion of the 30-day engagement, Miss Grace Bennett agrees to permanently withdraw from all personal and professional contact with Ethan Carter. No future communication, meetings, correspondence, or relationship of any kind shall continue after the contract expires. This condition is final and legally binding." Grace felt the words echo through her chest. She instinctively looked toward Ethan, searching his face for some sign that he had known about the clause. Instead, she saw the same disbelief reflected in his eyes. He quietly reached for the agreement, reading the paragraph himself. His expression hardened. "I never approved this language." Victoria folded her arms. "Nevertheless, your attorneys did. Your signature is on every page." Ethan turned another page, then another, finally realizing what had happened. During the final revisions, the legal team had inserted the trustees' standard separation clause without discussing it directly because similar provisions existed in several previous family agreements. He had assumed the last page contained routine legal formatting. Grace had assumed exactly the same thing. Neither of them had ever read it after the revisions were complete. Richard leaned forward from the opposite side of the table. "Is the clause enforceable?" One of the company attorneys cleared his throat carefully. "Legally, yes. Both signatures are valid." Grace lowered her eyes for a moment. Suddenly, every quiet conversation, every shared breakfast, every genuine smile they had exchanged over the past weeks seemed to carry an invisible expiration date she had never known existed. Ethan closed the agreement slowly before placing it on the polished conference table. His voice remained remarkably calm. "This meeting is over." Victoria shook her head. "Not until the board understands whether this engagement is real or simply another contractual performance." Ethan looked directly at every director in the room before answering. "It began as an agreement. I will not deny that." A murmur spread around the table. Grace felt her heart sink, believing he was about to confirm everyone's worst assumptions. Instead, he continued, "But somewhere between the signatures and today, something changed that no attorney could have drafted." The room became quiet again. Ethan turned toward Grace, his expression carrying none of the distance she had first seen in the coffee shop weeks earlier. "When I met Grace, I believed I was hiring someone to solve a business problem. I was wrong. She reminded me that trust cannot be negotiated, kindness cannot be purchased, and respect cannot be written into a contract. She earned the admiration of this company without asking for it. She earned mine without trying." Grace felt tears gathering in her eyes, but she remained silent. Ethan reached for the agreement once more. Every person in the room watched him. Very carefully, he separated the final page from the rest of the document. The sound of the paper sliding free seemed louder than anyone's breathing. Then, without anger or drama, he tore the page cleanly down the middle. He placed both pieces on the conference table. If leadership depends on a condition that demands I abandon someone who has brought honesty into my life, then that condition is not worthy of protecting this company. Several directors stared in complete surprise. Richard slowly stood from his chair. Ethan, do you understand what this decision could cost you? Ethan nodded without hesitation. Yes. You could lose the trust. Then I lose it. His answer came so naturally that even Victoria appeared stunned. Grace stepped closer. You do not have to sacrifice everything because of me. Ethan smiled gently. This is not because of you. This is because I finally understand what my grandfather was trying to teach me all along. A company can recover from financial loss. A person does not always recover after compromising their values. Richard remained silent for several long moments before quietly collecting the torn pieces of paper. He looked at the clause one final time, then at Grace. Perhaps we have all been measuring stability the wrong way. One by one, several directors slowly nodded in agreement. Even the company attorney admitted that the clause had been added automatically during the final drafting process without recognizing how unusual the circumstances had become. Victoria realized the room had shifted beyond her control. The contract she believed would end the engagement had instead exposed something impossible to manufacture. As she quietly gathered her briefcase, she understood that authenticity had defeated strategy. Grace looked toward the torn page resting on the conference table. Only days earlier it had represented security, payment, and obligation. Now it represented freedom. Yet neither she nor Ethan realized that the greatest decision still remained ahead of them, because the board had not yet voted, and the future of both their hearts and the company would soon depend upon whether the people in that room believed love was finally stronger than the contract that had brought them together. The annual trustee meeting took place exactly 1 week later inside the historic auditorium that overlooked the Chicago River, where generations of Carter family leaders had accepted the responsibility of guiding the company into the future. Grace sat quietly in the front row beside Margaret and Daniel, her hands folded gently in her lap. She wore the same elegant navy dress from the first charity gala, not because it was the most expensive one prepared for her, but because it reminded her of the evening she had stopped pretending to fit into Ethan's world and simply chose to be herself. Across the room, investors, executives, employees, and members of the Carter family filled every seat. The atmosphere felt serious but hopeful. When Richard stepped onto the stage, the conversation slowly faded into silence. He looked toward Ethan before addressing the audience. For many years, this family believed leadership could be measured by numbers, contracts, and carefully written conditions. Those things remain important. But over the past month, we have all witnessed something far more valuable. Character cannot be inherited. It must be demonstrated. He paused before smiling warmly toward Grace. Sometimes the greatest lesson arrives from someone who was never expected to teach it. Gentle applause filled the auditorium. Richard continued. After careful review, the trustees have unanimously agreed to remove the outdated contractual clause requiring personal separation as a condition of succession. Effective immediately, Ethan Carter will assume full leadership of Carter Global because he has demonstrated not only sound judgment in business, but the courage to place integrity above personal advantage. The room erupted into applause, but Ethan remained standing quietly, his attention fixed on only one person. Grace smiled through grateful tears, believing the difficult chapter had finally ended. She could not have been more surprised when Ethan walked away from the stage instead of accepting congratulations. He crossed the auditorium until he stood directly in front of her. Every camera turned toward them, but for the first time neither of them seemed to notice. Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed the small velvet ring box Grace had first received beside Lake Michigan. He opened it slowly. The same diamond rested inside, shining beneath the auditorium lights. The first time I offered you this ring, he said softly. It represented an agreement with an ending already written into it. Today I want to ask a very different question. Grace looked at him with quiet disbelief. Ethan continued, his voice steady and sincere. You once asked me to promise that I would never treat you like part of a payment. Somewhere along this journey, you gave me something far more valuable than anything written inside a legal document. You reminded me who I wanted to become. You made my home feel warm again. You made success feel meaningful again. Grace Bennett, there is no contract now. There is no deadline. There is no obligation. There is only one promise I hope we can write together for the rest of our lives. Will you marry me for real? The room became perfectly still. Grace smiled through happy tears before laughing softly at the unbelievable journey that had brought them there. Yes, she whispered. Then, with complete confidence, she repeated the answer loudly enough for everyone to hear. Yes, I will. Ethan gently placed the ring on her finger, and the applause that followed felt less like celebration for a billionaire and more like joy for two ordinary people who had found each other in extraordinary circumstances. 6 months later, they were married in a small lakeside ceremony attended by family, close friends, company employees, and several scholarship students whose education Carter Global now proudly supported. There were no extravagant fireworks or unnecessary displays of wealth. Instead, there were handwritten vows, quiet laughter, and genuine gratitude. Inside the entrance of Carter Global's headquarters, a glass display now held the torn final page of the old agreement beside a framed handwritten note from Ethan. Visitors often stopped to read the single sentence beneath it. The contract protected a company. Love transformed the people who signed it. Every employee understood its meaning. Every new executive learned the story during orientation. And every time Grace walked through those doors, she smiled at the memory of a rainy morning in a neighborhood coffee shop, because the greatest change in her life had never begun with a billionaire's fortune. It had begun with a simple act of kindness, an honest conversation over a cup of black coffee, and the courage of two people who discovered that the strongest promises are never the ones written on paper, but the ones faithfully lived every single day.